Hi, I'm Christopher Ray, and welcome to the third of three video lectures about Zhu Tianwen's novella Notes of a Desolate Man. I encourage you also to check out the brief video lecture I made about Zhu Tianwen's life and works. In this video lecture, I want to focus on language. What does language mean as represented in this novel? Because we have a lot of profound doubts expressed. I could see my rhetoric fall to the ground. However, we also have an affirmation of language, just in the actual profusion of language and ideas that comes through in this rather bewildering work. As I mentioned in the previous video lectures, I think that a lot of the exploration of language, a lot of the searching that we get, is really prompted by this sense of crisis, that we have the death of an individual, we have the exploration of a way of life, and that the response of our narrator is to go through this textual and geographic travel. And I think there's something that's very postmodernist about this, so I want to talk about postmodernism, particularly the notion of relativism, that in order to understand our own experience, we have to put it into conversation with other experiences and other ideas. And so there's a lot of reconstruction of meaning going on through this wide-ranging exploration. But I think it begs the question, like, why are we doing this? Why are we taking this tour through texts and ideas? So I think there are some answers that are personal to the author about Zhu Tianwen's particular interests in French theory and Italian and Japanese cinema. But I think that there's also a type of cultural cosmopolitanism being posited as a positive thing. And that if you can see yourself with the compound eyes of culture, you can help get a type of redemption. And so I want to finish by talking about writing itself as an act of redemption, something that is almost ritualistic or reverent. It's almost like a religion unto itself. In the video lecture about Queer Taiwan, I mentioned that Xiao represents gay men as being nationless, as people without a homeland. And in this video lecture, I want to argue that Xiao also represents writing, or the written word, as being the final homeland, at least for him. But this novel also raises profound doubts about the written word. Is this indeed a stable refuge, or is it just yet another evasion? Here's another way to phrase the question. We have this splendid profusion of language at this fin de siècle moment. Does it create any meaning? Does it add up to anything? Or is it just assorted bric-a-brac? At one point late in the novel, the narrator is out shopping with his friend in a Taipei boutique. They're looking at all these retro or vintage objects, and he writes, "It seemed to me that I could see my rhetoric fall to the ground, a broken string of pearls that skittered and bounced off in all directions like pachinko balls among the goods for sale." And there's a lot packed into just this brief passage. We have a game, a Japanese game, and one in which this is a broken string of pearls. So it's not like all of the ideas or all of the references are strung together into one band, right, or a piece of jewelry that you can wear. No, they're all broken. They will all fall down at the end. It will be game over. One of the ways to read this novel is just to go through and count the number of balls and look at their variety, look at their different shapes and sizes and colors. Trying to impose a singular meaning on this novel would be very reductive. But we also have this question, well, is there any sum greater than the parts that we get within all of these balls bouncing around? Zhu Tianwen's narrator spends a lot of time talking about Claude Lévi-Strauss and Michel Foucault, theorists who focused on foreign cultures and, of course, in the process of doing ethnographic fieldwork, also had a lot of reflections about, say, French culture or human culture and what are the kind of fundamental things that make us human. The narrator spends a lot of time discussing Foucault's multi-part work, The History of Sexuality, which begs this question of why, as moderns, do we keep saying that our sexuality is being repressed? The narrator also talks about Foucault himself as being someone who struggled a lot with his own homosexual sexuality and felt very tortured by this and tried to kind of break free from this subaltern status through discourse itself. Xiao also makes many allusions to the cinema from Hong Kong, from mainland China, from North America, from Europe. Two particular touchstones in the world of cinema are the Italian director Federico Fellini, who is a very stylish connoisseur of nostalgia and desire, the desire for the past and the desires of the past. Ozu Yasujiro is another one of the world's great directors whose work Xiao refers to several times during the story. So we could ask questions about intention and speculate about, well, what did Zhu Tianwen mean by displaying all of this cultural and theoretical knowledge? But I would prefer to focus on the effects. To me, this display does a few things. One is that it shows wisdom. It shows a critical capacity that is born of cosmopolitan knowledge. By familiarizing yourself with ideas from around the world, you can better critique yourself and better critique the ideas of others. Another is this inclination or this imperative to keep searching, There's this relentless motivation to look here, to look there, until you find something that satisfies you. One of the interpretive challenges of this work is to determine to what extent is one idea just displacing another, and then the next idea displacing that. So to what extent are the different pearls not linked together? And to what extent might we link them together with different strands of meaning? In my view, one subtext of this search is that maybe at the beginning we're looking for some type of durable meaning, but this eventually transitions towards an acceptance that we can have sensations, we can have temporary evanescent feelings. Yet notwithstanding this impermanence, Xiao Xiao as our narrator and guide, I think does affirm the value of writing and of language and of recording things down, these thoughts, feelings, and memories, even if they won't last forever. We could explain the existence of some of these cultural references through biographical criticism. Zhu Tianwen is a screenwriter, and so of course she is well versed in the cinema, so of course she is going to cite a lot of films in her work. But this can be a little bit tautological. More significant to me is asking the question, well, what do these films, what do these cinematic references do? And as we look for patterns and how these references occur, we could focus on the structure as well. So Federico Fellini comes up near the beginning and near the end of this book. After Ayao dies, Fellini dies. And so this is a book that is cinematic to the end, or that seems to be affirming the importance of cinema within this whole enterprise. So I am arguing that some of this display of all of these different cultural references is postmodernist. So I want to give a very kind of quick and dirty distinction between modernism, postmodernism, and what we might call nihilism. Modernism is connected to the realization that we have broken away from the past, that tradition no longer has the same hold over us. And this can give rise to either despair or to a sense of liberation, and that now we can create our own meanings. But whether you like it or whether you don't like it, meaning we accept is no longer what it once was. Postmodernism is not just saying that we have broken from the past and so now we are free to create our own new meanings. It is going one step further. It is saying that meaning itself is fundamentally unstable. And when you define one thing, you have to define it in terms of something else. And then you have to define that thing in terms of something else. And so you keep going down this road where meaning is continually deferred, and it seems to be forever evading our grasp. Postmodernism can be very playful and affirmative. It can clash together a bunch of seemingly incongruous things from various sources. Nihilism is very negative. It takes this postmodern notion that meaning is continually deferred and says, well, life is just meaningless. Knowledge is impossible. There exist no moral truths, and to hell with it all. So of these three, nihilism is by far the most despairing. Much of the criticism surrounding Notes of a Desolate Man has been in a postmodernist vein. And this is one particular interpretation, that Notes of a Desolate Man is both an expression of postmodernism and a critique of postmodernism. In my view, Notes of a Desolate Man is not inveighing against a debauched, contagious, and invasive foreign lifestyle in literature, but I can understand how that interpretation would come about. Fido would be a good example. Fido is the name of a character, this young gay man whom Xiao Xiao meets and has a brief relationship with, and on his t-shirt, there is this description of who Fido is. Fido is just Fido. Fido never bothers everyone. Fido understands everything. Fido does not judge. Fido means X, Y, and Z. And so Fido seems to represent everything, but also nothing. This is an actual brand mascot. It's also the name of a Canadian telecom, but never mind that. And of course, since Xiao Xiao is 40 years old and Fido is much younger, there's maybe a little bit of fear of displacement there. But if Fido was all, how could we make our voices heard if this empty signifier just takes up all of the oxygen? Then there's this guy in 1993 when this novella was being written, at the peak of his fame. This global pop superstar, the king of pop, adored by millions, is like a pharaoh of old building his own tomb. He is a figure of horror because he is so desperately afraid of death. So this novel takes us on a journey through texts and icons, but there are also geographical wanderings by this nationless gay man. So what are we looking for and what are we finding? This novel takes us all over the world. The characters travel to many different continents and cities. And are these destinations? Or are these just places that we're passing through? And what is the meaning of this travel? What does all the movement bring for the characters? What is the value being generated here? Is it a mode of escape? Is it a type of pleasurable consumption? Are we seeking refuge away from where we come from? Or is there some type of self-seeking going on here? I think that the answers to all of those questions are probably affirmative, that movement and travel has all of these different functions. And there are moments when the physical travel and the emotional or psychological travel converge. So at one point, Xiao Xiao goes to India and says, it was like arriving at the wasteland inside my heart. Wasteland, of course, would remind people of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, which he talks about as being a work of memory and desire. And it's worth paying attention to the different interpretive rubrics that our narrator applies to these different places. So when we arrive at Varanasi, this is a place that we've seen before in cinema. So this is a place of recognition, not discovery. And one particular film has a significant title, The Unvanquished. Readers familiar with Chinese literary history will know that India has particular spiritual resonance in the Chinese cultural context. In the Ming Dynasty novel, The Journey to the West referred to is not Europe and America, it is India, where we have a Tang Dynasty monk and several anthropomorphic supernatural companions going in search of enlightenment, particularly in the form of Buddhist sutras. And in Notes of a Desolate Man, we have the Diamond Sutra being invoked. This is something that the faithful don't have to understand, for as long as they recite the sonorous passages, they will reach the other shore. The Diamond Sutra is said to be the earliest print book, and so this is a significant work in the history of writing. But Xiao Shao decides that he's going to recite his own sutra, the red and green color table. So Xiao Shao is taking a religious practice and applying it to a non-religious sphere, or creating his own religion, you could say. And this is one where there is a profusion of different colors. Elsewhere in the novel, Xiao Shao mentions that, according to the anthropologist Levi Strauss, religions like Islam are very masculine in orientation, in being focused on the abstract, the unified, and the monotheistic. And what Xiao Shao gives us instead is things that are not abstract. Colors are very, you can see them right there. And so we have something that seems to be like a queering of religion or spirituality by rejecting the masculine and trying to break things into not just one singular monotheistic thing, but into an endless profusion of different colors. The listing of colors in Notes of a Desolate Man brings to mind the listing of colors and smells in Zhu Tianwen's earlier story, Fin de Siècle Splendor. Color is a type of form, and I detect in the listing of all of these different types of form a desire to abandon oneself to form, and that in doing so we can achieve a kind of compound vision in which we are no longer constrained by the tyranny of meaning. So the meaning that just says X equals Y, this represents that. Well, a postmodernist would respond, if X equals Y, well then how do you define Y? And it just keeps going on and on. But if we just focus on the form itself, all of these different gradations of color, there is some value there. And we want to almost like enter a reverie, because what is life after all? We want to forget to return to the real world. We want to lose ourselves in form. I think that the metaphor of the compound eyes is justifiable here because at a couple points in the novel, there's reference to this horror film, The Fly, about a horrific transition or metamorphosis. And there's even two versions. There's a classic or original version and a remake. And Xiao Shao refers to himself and Ayao as being the classic version, right? They live a more terrifying, tragic, and beautiful version of life, not this cheesy remake from later on. And of course, Ayao, as someone dying of AIDS, is going through his own metamorphosis. And so it seems like there's an attempt to reclaim something through this compound aestheticizing vision. Later in this course, we'll talk about another work that deals with compound eyes, The Man with the Compound Eyes by Wu Mi. Within this work, I do think that there is an affirmation of writing as a reverent act, and that there is a world of letters that one can help construct and create for one's own. One phrase appears several times in the novel, almost like a religious incantation. Yes, myth and forgetfulness. And there's a lot of religious imagery in this work of Christ on the cross, or Xiao Shao witnessing Shakyamuni's progress through bodily suffering to enlightenment, which is likened to the ordeal being undergone by Ayao. We may recognize a familiar pattern in however far you travel, you ultimately come home again, at least spiritually and emotionally, and that Xiao Shao's journey to the West, to India, to this place of enlightenment, reminds him of everyday Taiwan. Notably, there is one place that Xiao Shao himself does not go, even though Yongjie does go there doing documentary film work, and that is mainland China. And he mentions, yes, on my map of the world, I skipped only that vast piece of land. So why? And I find it very interesting that Xiao Shao has a revelation about language that immediately follows his reflection about China. Right? This is the hegemonic China that has excluded Taiwan. I finally realized that the place I longed to visit, the place I dreamed about, cannot actually exist. It is an unattainable place that has always existed only in the written word. Wu Zhuoliu is a writer who is sometimes referred to as the father of Taiwanese literature. He wrote primarily under colonialism. Taiwan was a Japanese colony from 1895 to 1945. And he wrote Orphan of Asia in Japanese. It was later translated into Chinese and into English. And he was a writer who represented this search, a wandering through Taiwan, through Japan, through mainland China, as one that was ultimately futile in the search for a Taiwanese identity. So this is a novel that's very pessimistic, where Taiwan is a perpetual subaltern, a perpetual outsider. So Wu Zhuoliu seemed to reject the notion that language can be a homeland. Early on, Xiao Xiao talks about writing as a type of a crucible, an ordeal that has to be gone through, one that is very violent, that takes a bodily toll, but that is worthwhile. But there are a lot of doubts attendant on these different affirmations of writing. At one point, Xiao Xiao mentions, "My greatest consolation was to be alone with words in a clean house." Like he wanted to keep out all of the clutter, all of the dirtiness, all the complications of the outside world. Later on the same page, he says, "My supernatural was words, writing," as opposed to some other religious source, say. But there's something a little bit morbid almost in a focus on cleanliness. So this is a good question for you. Ultimately, is this a novel that does present writing as a type of redemption or just another type of self-delusion or evasion? Because in Aya's words at the beginning, redemption is the worst example of placing blame on others. At the end of the novel, however, Xiao Xiao does write that my writing it continues, despite everything else, despite all of these qualifications. The very last message we get in this book, though it doesn't summarize the entire book, is that writing is the least that one can do.